Welcome to the Underscore Transformation Podcast. My name is Joe Ailes.
My name's Jason West.
And together we're the founders of Underscore. This week's episode is the second in our bonus mini-series that focuses on the future of work and the impact that the global pandemic has had on organizations already dealing with seismic changes in the workplace. Last week, we were joined by three special guests: Marc Weedon, the International HR Director at Zuora; Steve Hunt, Head of Talent Acquisition at Citi; and Richard Phelps, the Management Consultant and co-founder of the Human Times news service. And they're back again for the second part of our conversation. Last week, we discussed the rapid, disruptive change brought about by the pandemic and organizations' response in the first few weeks of the crisis. So, Jason, what have we got coming up this week?
This week, we're focusing on the medium to long-term changes to business brought about by COVID-19, its impact on mental health, the effects on society of rapid digital transformation, some really practical tips for managing video conferences, how businesses are starting to repurpose their real estate, and we touch on the skills that HR professionals will need to best respond to this new world that's emerging, and frankly, a whole lot more. It was a really interesting conversation.
No, it really was. We closed out last week's episode with Richard considering the cultural impact of this sudden shift to remote working, the increases in productivity that have been seen, and what it means for where people can live and work in the future. I was keen to understand from Richard what the impact will be on teams delivering products and services to customers remotely, and whether we will see the world reverting back to the way it was once the crisis is over.
Well, my view on that, Joe, is we won't, because I think competitively, organisations have worked out that digital there are huge advantages to it. And if you get the right people, and you need to train people to become more digital, to take cost out, to become more effective. So I personally think it's
here to stay.
It's almost like it's one of the major challenges for HR and leadership is to question how digital are we? Do we need to become more digital? How do we do that? Who's got the skills? Have we got everyone skilled up? I think it's also from a society perspective, a broader issue now, because it's clear that, there's 30, 40 million people unemployed now in the US, and I'm not even sure how many here. For those who are not digitally trained, they won't be able to get back into the workforce, So it's clear, for me, and from everything I've seen and read, that is, we've moved now 10, 15 years into the future. And organisations have got to adapt to it. It's going to be difficult because I think we all like what we did in the past. And if you look at the organisations that are, as we know, if you look at the NASDAQ and organisations that are performing better now, they're all the ones that are actually
adapted to
more technology driven and adapted more quickly.
Interesting.
Yeah, isn't it? It's an interesting one from a societal impact perspective. There's going to be a lot of disenfranchised people potentially if we really truly have seen a very permanent shift into the future by 5, 10, 15 years. Yeah. Just how countries, societies deal with that is going to be a pressing issue.
I think that's right, Jason. Yeah.
How much have you seen that, is anybody thinking about this that you've kind of seen reported in the press or anything like that at this stage, or is it still very much focused on dealing with the here and now?
Jason, I think that there's a lot more pressure on, I think that there's different markets here. A lot of people on this podcast there from big corporates. So, the big corporates are in a good position to retrain people and also to mentally look after their staff as well. And I think there's probably more pressure now on corporates to do the mental health stuff. There's a lack of trust around government more generally at the moment, in the last few years than there has been. But there's no question that this is a big new area. Well, it's not so much new, but there's huge amounts of suppliers coming into the market providing apps. Most organizations now have got chief happiness officers or wellness officers, and they have clearly become much more important over the last 2 or 3 months. Organizations are now trying to work out how they measure the level of mental health issues they've got, how they look at people individually as well as collectively. A lot of technology is emerging around this, particularly apps that are kind of people are using. Obviously people are working a lot at home. There's lots of stresses at working at home. And organisations are having to deal with that. I mean, I'm sure we're all aware that what I've seen from eight HR functions is that quite a number of them have got a lot more during this pandemic. That there's been a lot of focus on providing, very practical terms, regular calls to individuals to find out how they're coping, and kind of call-ins with individuals who they see as high risk, etc. So, it's all stepped up the mental health side of things. There was essentially an awful lot of discussion about it before, but now it's almost certainly one of the biggest topics there is.
Yeah, I agree with Richard. I think the one thing this crisis has done is put mental health very much on the agenda. And like he said, I think during this time, engagement is absolutely key. And at a time when you're pushing everybody remotely, it's all around how do you make sure people still feel connected despite being so dispersed. And so some of the things, at a practical level, which we've been doing as a business, for example, is I think as Steve mentioned it earlier, we've had a weekly leadership call, both at a global executive committee plus one level down, plus also regionally, we have weekly leadership calls just for business updates and how things are going and just checking in. We're a big user of Slack, so all sorts of Slack channels have popped up now for working remotely and sharing best practices around that, both for managers who manage remote teams, but also just a general Slack channel at home where people are just saying, hey, this worked for me, it might work for you. And then there's, particularly at the outset, I think people are getting a bit tired of it now, but particularly at the outset where you've lost the social dimension to work, there's all sorts of virtual stuff happening where we are trying to replicate that social angle. So, we're having virtual pubs, virtual quizzes, virtual coffee mornings, virtual desert island discs, all that sort of stuff's been done. But I think it's important because there needs to be an acknowledgement. And again, I think Richard alluded to this, that there is now more than ever before a collision between work and home life. And that is causing problems. So how do you provide a support infrastructure to deal with this? And, it's always pretty fortunate in the sense that we already had a reasonable infrastructure in place. So we've always had an employee assistance program, for example, through Workplace Options. And we've been promoting that very heavily throughout this pandemic. We've a long-time subscriber to LinkedIn Learning, and they've got a number of courses around remote management. So I know those courses have been downloaded even more times. And we've just subscribed to a mindfulness app, which has got sort of 1,000+ hours of content around how to maximize your sort of work-life flexibility in this particular environment. But then aside from that, it's kind of taking your cues from your leaders and what they're doing. So, various leaders around our business, and these are being adopted, across the board. When you're scheduling a meeting, do you need that meeting? Because everyone's getting very tired of Zoom and that's impacting mental health. So, be careful around what it is and who's invited. But when you are scheduling it, schedule it for 25 minutes or 55 minutes instead of half an hour, and that builds in mini breaks. Making sure you build in exercise, making sure you have an hour off for lunch, setting a start and end to your day rather than letting it drift at the end of each day. We're starting to do Zoom free days now. So, have this, next Wednesday, Zoom free day, for example, in some areas. Yes. And as an organization, every month since the pandemic started, we've had the executive committee said, right, we're having next Friday off. So there's been a monthly Friday off just to enable people to recharge their batteries. And the amount of positive feedback we get just saying, Christ, I needed that day off just for a 3-day weekend. And then you've got to manage the mental health as we come out of this as well. So what we're doing is reassuring people that as we come out of the other end, particularly with regard to any office reopening, we're providing reassurance that any reopening we do is going to be very much considered. And by the way, you don't have to come back to the office. So if you want to work from home indefinitely, then that's fine. We'll go with that. And I think that's provided a lot of reassurance that people can choose to flex how and when they work, basically.
Mark, what you're saying makes absolute sense. I'm sure that this is going to become a critical area for for organisations to get right, and HR functions should be right in the thick of it. To the extent that, as you say, you've got it's very nuanced. There are different types of environments that are going to be helpful for different people in different circumstances. As Steve was saying, you've got little young people in their 20s will need different support to older people and people with families, etc. But this is all going to be about how you really get the best performance out of people, especially as in my view, there's no question this is not a temporary situation. We're moving to more of a remote world. I mean, my guess is that from what I've seen is that, we're probably looking at maybe 30% of people going back to work. I mean, already many organisations are talking about not needing so much office space, and the office space that they have, they're talking about making it different, not having places for individuals to work, but it's just making it more for meetings for teams, etc. So this is a critical area for organisations to get right now.
And it does seem to be a lot more just mentally taxing being on Zoom calls all day rather than being in back-to-back meetings for some reason. I don't know why that is, but it's there's something about the kind of the continuous video conferencing that does seem to be a bit more mentally taxing.
Jason, I totally agree with you. It's exhausting.
Yeah.
But we're only just getting into this, and I guess as Marc was talking about, that there will be best practices for this. How should people behave? How long should the meeting be? What should be the protocol, etc. I mean, you can see great things coming out of this, but at the moment, everyone's trying to work it out.
Yes, and I really like your point, Marc, about the shorter meetings give people space. We've seen it in our training business, in that we had to take day, 2 day, 3 day long courses and then break them down into no more than an hour webinar sessions, because people just cannot cope with any more than that. But the upside is that you can fit instead of having to send someone away for 2 days, they just fit an hour here and there around over a 2-week period, and they get to digest the learning in between and then go and apply it in their day job. And actually some of the learning outcomes have been much better than if you'd sent somebody off for a 2-day course.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you said there's almost an element of learning as you go along. We had a quarterly business review, which is normally a day off in a nice city somewhere, which kind of lasts 8 hours. And we said, we'll just do it over Zoom. So we had an 8-hour Zoom call. Christ. And the learning was, we're not doing that again. So our next QBR, we're actually breaking up into hour-long segments over a 3-week period. So there's an element of, if you try it and if it doesn't work, you adjust it.
Yeah. So, Steve, working for an international, a multinational organisation, you must be the king of Zoom by now. How have you found it?
Well, actually, we didn't have Zoom to start with. We have our own conferencing technology, which as we scaled up that infrastructure, we were doing a lot of phone calls to start with, and then it's moved into Zoom. So yeah, that sort of changed over time as well. But actually, what I was thinking about as everyone was talking was, I think there's a very strategic HR challenge to what we're facing, which has been a perennial issue for HR, which is capacity planning. Resource planning in the business, but also thinking about that from the HR function in this situation. When we were discussing the various challenges at a personal level, what is productivity? How do you size productivity? I know from a TA perspective that, it's one of the easiest areas, of course, to capacity plan, because you can, apply a lot of metrics to it. But how do you size the different availability of your employee base, bearing in mind all the factors that we're now coping with? And so I think that plays into when you start thinking about, how you work, how you communicate, how you make things effective. I think that's going to be a major challenge. And I do think that talks to all the issues that that are on the table here when you think about things like location strategy, for example, and the type of skills that you need. So I think that's something that, needs to be front and center, as we start to probably change the design of certain parts of the organization. And I think we know what lacks generally, right? It's a skill that needs developing within HR.
Steve, I'm totally with you on that. I mean, the whole workforce planning piece now moving forward is critical. Understand, this simple stuff, but it looks as if we're going to have a more difficult time economically. So what is this, what are the issues here around costs now, for example? I mean, there's all sorts of questions that need to be answered. What are the skills we need for the future? People's roles, will they change? Do we need as many people? What about the digital? If we bring all the remote working, does that save us a lot of money? Do we need all those things? And that hasn't really been talked through. And I think at the moment it's kind of interesting because there has been a whole mantra about people before profits. And it's almost, I've read quite a lot on this. There's almost an embarrassment at the moment to make money. So it's, we've got to put our people first, et cetera, et cetera. But I think as we get into this more difficult period now where furloughing and things stops being in place, and it's going to there's going to be a lot of questions about organisations, some of the ethics around getting rid of people, and what is the purpose of an organisation as well, which HR really need to be thinking about. Is it all about delivering shareholder value, or is it more about there's a lot of talk about sustainability, more of a green culture, green environment, etc., giving stuff back to the community, which I think organisations are thinking about a lot more now as we come through into the next phase, really.
Yeah, and when it comes to making those difficult decisions around size and shape of organisation, potential restructuring and all that side of things, to Steve's point, your kind of core unit as you kind of do your normal resource planning is your FTE, but those FTEs used to be fairly consistent. They generally, people working 8 hours, starting at 9, ending at 6 or whatever. Now that kind of working day just doesn't quite exist in the same way, and people might, work to a certain number of hours, or potentially do we perhaps start moving more towards an output focused engagement with people? Is that a potential outcome of this, that we go back way into the past where people are paid for what they produce rather than for the time that they spend in the office?
I think in the the first instance, you just need to gauge employee sentiment around that. And we've ran a couple of surveys. So one is part of our normal quarterly pulse, where we asked people around how they felt that we were dealing with the crisis, for example. And as we're starting to reopen offices, we're also surveying people's opinions around how much productivity has been impacted by home working, what their appetite to returning to the office is, what they want to be doing going forward, etc. And what we're finding is that a significant majority of the respondents are saying that home working has not impacted my productivity. So that's kind of 80% plus actually in most cases.
Wow.
And, in the return to office surveys, which we've done so far, and this excludes the US, which is our home territory, where our HQ is based and where most of our employees are based, because we're not starting to open offices there at the moment. But across EMEA and Asia Pacific, where we started to do this, 70% plus of employees want to retain flexibility. So they're saying, by all means, reopen an office, but I want to still be able to choose how I work. And the office will be a drop-in center for me rather than a permanent location.
So I think that's fascinating that that you're getting that feedback, because that's very different to what the view of people working remotely was before. In many organisations, it was viewed as, well, you need to be in the office a few days a week, working from home. If you really need to, fine. But that's totally changed. It will now, I think, totally change. I mean, to the extent that most people will want to work from home, or it's almost so much wanting to work from home, having the right to work from home, and also having the right to go into the office. So it's kind of their choice.
You are listening to the Underscore Transformation Podcast. If you'd like a few more tools in your crisis management kit bag, why not visit underscore-group.com/CMR toolkit to hone your crisis management skills, lead your organisation through recovery.
I think what the crisis has shown is very rapidly you can change an organisation and it doesn't fall apart.
Exactly.
So there was this suspicion about remote working in the past. Leaders there are some leaders who are thinking you've got to be seen to be trusted, or I don't know if you're doing a good job unless I can see what you're doing, sort of scenario. But in the last 3 months, what we've been able to demonstrate is you can work from home. You don't have to be visible, but you're still being productive. And so I think that particular genie's out of the bottle now, and I don't think it's ever going to be put back in.
What's the impact going to be on the one I worry about is innovation. You've alluded to it, Mark, that you're contemplating, or you've actually offered, extend permanent working from home for people that want it, and some organisations are already kind of in that space, as you've mentioned earlier. How do they deal with those kind of water cooler conversations, and when you can't physically get people together, how do you kind of drive that innovation within a business?
I think the innovation has started already. So I think the moment we shut the office down or offices down, that's where the innovation started. It started with the lockdown, basically, because you had to repivot the way you're thinking. You had to rethink about how you engage with people. You had to redesign how you're hiring people, onboarding people, learning and developing people, managing people remotely, and so forth. So for me, the innovation has already started, and what the crisis has done is kind of accelerated stuff which has been blabbed about for a long time in the HR press. Yeah, and we've seen more progress in the last 3 months on some of these things than we have in 3 decades, frankly. So, from that perspective, it's not a case now of let's think about this innovation. It's kind of out there already. It's starting already.
Yes, I agree with that, Mark. This has proven that a lot of the older thinking has, things like being in the office, need to be seen, need to kind of appear at these various functions is not really necessary for productivity. But in terms of innovation, I think it is an interesting one. All of the academic research would say that, well, this is the old academic research, of course, but would say that in order to get innovation, you need to get people need to meet physically, and talk about things. You have to have working groups, etc. That's changed. It may be that actually was never true, but I suspect. I mean, what I've seen, organisations are now starting to, as I said earlier on, restructure their workplace to have more areas for people working together as teams. A number of them, the banks have talked about it recently in the press, and it may well be that you've got to have a mixture of people, on these kind of innovation or work teams working physically and, face to face and also remotely. And I guess it may actually help organizations to get more people involved in innovation than before.
Well, never waste a good crisis.
Yes, exactly. And remember, the lack of an office doesn't mean you can't meet.
Yes.
So we've got people in countries where we don't have offices, but if they want to meet up, we'll just say book out a meeting room somewhere in a hotel or whatever, and you can still do that on an ad hoc basis. So the ability to collaborate, because there's always going to be a human need for face-to-face stuff going on. That's not going to be removed. I think what this crisis is accelerating. And Zora not alone in this. This comes out through my HR network too, because we had a call about this last week. Is that what it is doing though is just causing organisations to think about their real estate footprint and what is the role of an office. So instead of being a place where you are more or less there permanently, you've got your allocated desk, it's more of a drop-in centre and it's a collaboration hub as opposed to anything else.
Yeah. And Steve, from your perspective, have you started shifting focus onto how you use your kind of footprint across EMEA?
I think everyone is thinking about that, but I think we've been very clear that we are an office-based company that has some flexibility, and I think for the size of organisation, the city has got so many different levels, so many different types of job, and we've, as I said, we've built up that credit by working together and collaborating together, over a period of time. So I think we will remain an office-based company, but we're looking at what it means from every lens really. I think we already had flexibility, and we clearly have the ability to work successfully across borders. So there's already a remote nature to that. But we've proved over the last few months that we can successfully serve our clients, and keep our employees productive and happy, through a very difficult period. But I think it's a lot of the things we're talking about, I think are becoming very real, because many employees will feel that, well, I've been, very successful working from home. And I think you can't forget the very personal nature of these things. If you think about someone who's commuting into London and is no longer paying, £5,000 for a season ticket and getting 3 hours or 4 hours back a day, you can't underestimate what that means to someone personally. And it's particularly important at different levels. So I think there is going to be generally, in the market, when I think about hiring, is these things are going to become much more important to candidates in terms of their decision making. And I think companies are going to have to respond to that. So we're thinking about all of these things as an organisation, as I'm sure many are. And I think it's going to change over time.
Steve, just on that, I think customers are going to expect things very differently, which is going to also impact on the way that people are managed. I was reading, I have been reading quite a lot recently about the financial services industry and the use of robots, customers being much more comfortable to use bots when they're calling and asking questions. So I think customers are getting more used to getting service through technology than ever before, and they've been forced to a large extent, everyone working from home or in this pandemic, to use remote services. So that's going to undoubtedly question organisation structure, because customers will be less used to, or will be more accepting of not doing what they have in the past to receive products and services. And also, they're probably going to want, more of a personal thing really, but probably going to want higher quality service. I'm sure everyone on this call, on this podcast today, has been doing a lot more cooking. I've personally been doing an awful lot of cooking over the last 3 months, and I've realised how how much it costs to create something which is actually quite good quality. And I feel quite sorry for the retail business or the restaurant business, because you don't start to you realise, when you go back to a restaurant, that you're expecting the quality levels to be much higher than you've been producing yourself. So I think there's going to be all sorts of interesting impacts, not just from the work, but customers are going to be demanding different things now. There's been that change over the last 3 months, not just for customers of the HR function, but customers of the whole of actually organisations like financial services customers, etc.
Yeah. And as we're moving out of this kind of survival phase into more recovery and rebuilding, what are the kind of main priorities that you see that the organisations need to have around their people? And there was a recent Gartner report that said 64% of HR leaders are prioritising employee experience as they think about the return to work. But what other demands are there? And is it right to put employee experience right at the top?
I think I mentioned this earlier. I think engagement is absolutely key with businesses coming out of this. And the first question which should be asked whenever we're looking at redesigning any process or introducing a new initiative or whatever is exactly that. What is the employee experience going to be? The role of HR in all of this is going to be critical. So as you said, we're coming out from this particular crisis, and now it's all about trying to rebuild the business. The spotlight that's putting on the HR function to make sure that the employees are engaged and have a good experience through this is absolutely key. So from an HR point of view, being able to understand what the language of the business is, mapping our strategy to the plans and priorities of the business as it emerges from this, being an ally and support to our leaders. So having an appropriate balance of supporting and guiding our leaders, but also challenging them and holding them to account for the changes which need to be made. That's an important balance to maintain. We've talked about culture already a number of times. So our role in being kind of the culture custodian, for want of a better term, and being very mindful of the fact that it's taken years and years and years for it to be where it is today. And given COVID's been such an accelerator, just making sure it's not denuded or destroyed in super quick time by an appropriate misstep, for example, is going to be key. That means as a HR person or an HR organization, we need to be appropriately opinionated. So particularly when it comes to matters on our turf. So if there's engagement issues, communication issues, motivation issues, and so forth, all the stuff around employee experience, we should be making sure that we are having our voice heard. Part of that is going to, not just put people at the centre of everything, but also keeping things simple. I think the danger coming out of this is there might be a tendency maybe to overcomplicate things. And I think at this point in time, people want to keep things simple. I mentioned earlier that one thing COVID has done is it makes you concentrate on what is absolutely core to the business, particularly when it comes to learning and development content and things such as that. So it kind of cuts away the fluff. And so we need to use this as an opportunity to do that. And then ultimately, the credibility of HR always lies in its ability to deliver. So just making sure we maintain that strong orientation to getting stuff done as we help our businesses come out of COVID is absolutely key. And, part of that, then you get down into your capabilities around planning, prioritization, project management, influencing, all that sort of thing.
So we're likely to see then an increased demand for things like user experience designs, broader solution design, change, project management within the HR function as a result of what's happened. But it's always been a bit of a challenge is finding HR professionals with those kind of skills. And do you see that as being an increasing problem as we kind of move into this kind of recovery phase?
I think it will be, Jason, but HR has to be right in the thick of things. It has to be really, there's an expression in the room where it happens,
Yes.
It's the Hamilton thing. It's got to be there right in the thick of things now, because all of these issues are people-related issues. Now, we know from all the surveys that we've done as HR professionals that HR is pretty lousy at project management, for example. So I think there will be, there is a shortage of HR people who can deliver this type of performance.
Yeah, I think that's actually. I think it accelerates what is a very well understood trend, which
yes, exactly, yeah.
Increasingly, HR needs. Jason was talking about user design. I think marketing skills across a number of different areas, project management, business analysis. All of those things talk to operational excellence, data-driven decision making. So that's obviously a shift that HR's been going through for a period of time. But I think the interesting trend, and I've seen this a lot in my own organisation, is increasingly we're bringing people from different parts of the business into HR to address that. So you'll get a lot of skills in areas like business offices, for example, which will have a focus on areas like resource planning within a business. And a lot of those types of individuals have a lot of transferable skills that I think can benefit HR. So my EMEA head of HR is actually an ex-communications professional. So I think that's a really good example of it. But I think that's something HR needs to do a lot more, is hire people from different parts of organisations to have a more diverse skill set.
With the to kind of Mark's earlier point, with the amount of innovation that businesses have kind of had to drive, that's resulted in wholesale changes to business strategies overnight in a lot of places. So there's been this really big demand on the whole organisation, but particularly on HR, because a lot of this has changed regarding people. The backdrop to that, though, is we're all severely constrained from a budget and cash flow, particularly perspective, even in industries where kind of revenues are broadly held up. So we've seen a lot of capital projects being paused or cancelled, and lots of business transformation programs kind of mothballed for a period of time. So as we get to something that looks a bit more stable, how soon do you think organizations will start thinking more about, well, what's our long-term reconfiguration? How do we best move to whatever this new abnormal is? Basically, when does the focus shift, do you think, more from the kind of 0 to 3 month planning horizon, further out?
Yeah, so from Zora's perspective, that there's always been a long-term plan to increase our annual recurring revenue from $200 million to $1 billion, and we haven't lost sight of that. I think what the crisis did was make the shorter-term planning horizons, which we have, just that little bit more shorter term.
Yeah.
But the usual quarterly cadence we have around our sales cycle, that's very much firmly back in place. But we had to make adjustments along the way because, obviously COVID has had an impact on the wider market. So, the pipeline, for example, isn't what it was a month ago or 2 months ago because other customers or potential customers are just putting off their purchasing decisions until they've got a bit more certainty around what they are doing. Yeah, the long-term piece is always there. I think the main thing from a professional point of view is for us to understand what we can do as HR leaders to help our leaders get back onto the front foot. It's a great opportunity at the moment to, there's also chat about HR never being at the top table, et cetera, et cetera. This is a unique opportunity to get there. And, it's through what Richard was saying. So it's getting to understand, what the business is about, what the priorities of the business are. From a practical point of view, that means us as HR people facilitating those conversations. What are the midterm, longer term plans? In our business, we launched objectives and key results back in September. So all of the HR business partners are trained OKR coaches. So being able to go into the business and facilitate objective key result sessions, facilitate business planning processes, all that sort of thing. Again, it's a great opportunity we should take advantage of. Equally, we should also be mindful around challenging the business as it comes out of this around culture, org design, cost base, real estate, all the other bits which we've talked of, and then understand how that impacts HR. And just making sure that all areas of HR, from the moment you bring somebody in to when they choose to leave, that we've done a complete overhaul of all of the HR processes, ways of working, to make sure it's kind of fit for the new world.
Yeah, just building on what Mark says, I totally agree with. It's an absolutely critical and golden opportunity now for HR professionals to get right into the thick of the planning process for the future, and to ensure that the people elements are very well covered. There are huge implications for organisations at the people side. One we haven't talked about is training. We are in a very different world now. Our customers want to interface with us in digital training. A huge area, behaviours. So it's a huge opportunity. But my view is that every HR function, they have to be right in the thick of it. If they're not, then they're not. It's going to be a very poor result for the organisation because they won't get the best result.
And what was a fantastic opportunity becomes a threat to the HR function in that organisation.
Yeah.
And Steve, from your perspective, has there been any change in kind of that long-term strategic projects, or is it just the here and now that's changed?
Yeah, I think it would. I mean, obviously, with the type of organisation that we are, our focus on clients is absolute, and that hasn't changed. Obviously, this is a health crisis, and we've been through major crises in financial markets before, of course. But financial services is a critical industry in terms of seeing us through this crisis. So, of course, our clients' needs, have changed dramatically in some cases, and our priority has been responding to that.
Gotcha. This is a podcast focused on business transformation and very much practical advice for people that are bringing about change in their organizations. So what would be the one thing our listeners should really focus on from a people perspective as we adjust to this new normal? So if I go to you, Mark, first, what's your view?
It's putting employees at the center of everything which you do. So as we seek to reopen offices, it's engaging with the people to understand their sentiment around how they've felt about remote working and what their views are around where and how they choose to work from going forward.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Steve?
Yeah, very similar. I mean, we have a sort of mantra, which it's not the date, it's the data. And clearly, as the situation develops, that's going to guide the decisions we make in opening offices, in the amount of people that can come back to those offices. But yeah, very much making that a personal choice for a number of employees. And the situation will evolve. So I think, how we respond to that will be very much putting our employees front and centre of the decisions that we make based on the data.
Fantastic, thank you. And Richard, to you.
Similar, really. I mean, HR has got to be right in the middle of the making sure the employee experience is fit for purpose.
Yeah. So I think that kind of focus on employee experience and putting employees front and centre is a great place to bring the discussion to a close. It's been fascinating, and I'd like to thank you all for your insights and contributions.
Thanks, it's been good.
Thanks, Jason. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. So these past couple of episodes, we've been focusing on HR's response to the pandemic, the stresses and strains it's placed on the HR function, and the opportunity it's presented for HR to take a real leadership role. Now, we've got a couple of weeks break coming up. Then we'll be back in early August with another expert panel to consider what the new demands being placed on the HR function mean for the HR profession and the skills and capabilities that they will need to develop to best respond as we move into a period of recovery and rebuilding. So remember to subscribe so you don't miss out on this upcoming episode. As ever, if you found this week's episode useful, please share this podcast with your colleagues. And why don't you leave a review? Your feedback is always welcome.
Thank you for listening, and stay safe, everybody.